Hi, my name is Vedika.
My name is Kana.
My name is Jigisha.
And my name is Bria. This video is about FDR and the New Deal.
On March 4th, 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt declared during his inaugural speech,
"The only thing we have to fear is fear itself."
Because of his inspiring words, many Americans felt confident that they had elected a man who was not afraid to take bold steps to solve the nation's problems.
After the stock market crash of October 1929, millions of investors were wiped out and the United States fell into what we know today as the Great Depression.
The economic depression lasted until the late 1930s. As investment and industrial output declined, failing companies fired workers, causing millions of people to become unemployed and homeless. Customers withdrew their deposits and banks became unable to make loans. The failure of banks to provide services caused Americans to distrust them. In addition, the Dust Bowl, a period of severe dust storms, greatly damaged agriculture, worsening this economic depression.
Then, in 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt arrived at the White House with a 100-day plan. Roosevelt's goals included relief, recovery, and reform. His plan, which consisted of a series of social programs, is known today as the New Deal. His plan was meant to reform American capitalism through direct federal relief instead of replacing it with a socialist system.
American and national identity.
American identity evolved during the 30s as FDR and his presidency redefined the role of the federal government in the lives of Americans. In the 1920s, the government had traded being an active agent of change for cooperating with big business. However, as a response to the Great Depression, the United States developed into a nation with a strong central government that was capable of overcoming economic depression with improved legislation. Unlike Hoover, Roosevelt addressed problems directly. As soon as Roosevelt was inaugurated, he declared a national bank holiday and closed all banks. He called together a special session of Congress. In this time, he proposed the Emergency Banking Act, which allowed the federal government to reopen banks that were solvent and help those that were not. This action gave hope to the people that the government will directly help them out during the Depression. Perhaps most importantly, people started regarding the government as a welfare agency that was obligated to help them in times of need.
One example of this welfare in action was the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. It employed millions of people into a variety of fields. Jobs in the arts specifically celebrated American middle-class culture and made them proud to be American. However, welfare programs also led to a clash in interests between classes. The Agricultural Adjustment Act worked to rid farmers of surplus livestock, and the Federal Emergency Relief Administration provided funding for higher wages and higher employment. These acts left the upper class feeling ignored by the federal government, and they strove to show off their wealth even more, which had been relatively untouched even after the stock market crash. This led to even more tension, sometimes culminating in violence, such as the Memorial Day Massacre in Chicago. It is determination that has pulled us through time and time again from crises worse than this one.
Eleanor Roosevelt said proudly about women, "Women were faced with the responsibility of keeping their families together and would find ways to save money and food. When women entered the workforce, they were scorned for trying to take jobs away from the more deserving men. Married women were especially at a disadvantage because men were expected to be the breadwinners of the family. Despite all this, the number of women working increased because women-dominated jobs were not as impacted as the men-dominated jobs."
As had become usual in American history, African Americans suffered more than any other group. Black wages were lower than white wages, and public works projects rarely benefited them. In addition, blacks who tried to unionize found themselves targets of lynch mobs. However, when communist groups started helping blacks, the federal government jumped in, tailoring the New Deal to help African American interests as well. Moreover, black identity became grounded in a sense of community, and they helped each other through tough times by caring for each other's children and sharing family resources with other blacks.
Politics and power.
While public opinion for FDR's policies was generally positive, the New Deal was somewhat controversial. Various groups opposed the New Deal as a threat to state rights. In 1934, leaders of several major corporations joined former presidential candidate Alfred Smith and conservative Democrats to establish the American Liberty League. The American Liberty League attacked the New Deal as a threat to not only state rights but also to free enterprise and open shop. They campaigned against the New Deal's radicalism, fearing that FDR was leading the United States towards socialism, bankruptcy, and dictatorship. The League had also been gearing up for the election of 1936 by attempting to secure either uncommitted or anti-New Deal delegations to the 1936 Democratic Convention in Philadelphia. Socialists and communists also criticized the New Deal for trying to save capitalism instead of working to lessen the inequality of power and wealth in the American society.
In response to this criticism, Roosevelt made several attacks on big business in the hopes to sway voters for the approaching 1936 election. Denouncing entrenched greed and the unjust concentration of wealth and power, he proposed that government should cut the giants down to size through antitrust suits and heavy corporate taxes. The Wealth Tax Act, which helped achieve a redistribution of income by raising the income taxes of the wealthy, was one way he achieved this. While his policies favored the common people, they turned many businessmen against Democrats.
African Americans have been loyal voters of the Republican Party since the end of the Civil War. However, during FDR's presidency, large numbers of black voters, as well as other ethnic minorities, switched their loyalties to the Democratic Party. They were part of the Democratic coalition, which included union members and white Southern farmers that elected FDR in 1936.
Work, exchange, and technology.
Poverty-stricken and often unemployed Americans called on the government for change. This change came partially in the form of the National Industrial Recovery Act, which aimed to limit production, institute industry-wide prices, and set workers' wages. However, this required a level of cooperation between business and government that many deemed idealistic, or worse, unconstitutional. For almost 2 years, government and industry worked closer than ever before. However, it all came to an end with the Supreme Court ruling of 1935, which claimed the act was an abuse of federal authority, effectively ending its term.
Also brought along by the New Deal was the building of the Norris Dam in 1936 by the Tennessee Valley Authority. Not only did it create more jobs, but it also improved agriculture in the Tennessee Valley, which had suffered during the Dust Bowl.
Another addition to the New Deal was the Social Security Act of 1935, an act still in place today. It addressed the problems surrounding social welfare by automatically collecting taxes from employees throughout their career as federal insurance. Once a person turned 65, he or she would then receive the money. Though seen as a radical move at the time, it turned out to be crucial to the life of older Americans because they now had a steady income after retirement.
Culture and society.
As people struggled to pay their bills, culture and American society evolved. People often resorted to theft or prostitution, and when this failed, they tried to find coping mechanisms. After the repeal of prohibition, coping often meant drinking. Slowly, alcohol and cigarettes became a larger part of American culture, and suicide became regarded as a normal way to cope by ending it all.
However, there were other healthier coping mechanisms as well. Many people turned to mass media and popular culture, which also served to dissolve regional boundaries and supported national connections. More importantly, though, they provided reassurance to the people. They would often tune into FDR's fireside chats on their radios, where he talked about various happenings around the country. His speech on banks was broadcasted to many Americans who in turn started trusting banks again as their president had requested.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks.
In order to satisfy the demand for radios, manufacturers produced newer and cheaper products. By the end of the 1930s, 27.5 million households owned radios. The radio also allowed people to experience events they would probably never attend.
Hollywood films, as well, were revived, and going to the movies became a popular pastime. Films were so powerful that they could drastically alter American attitudes and opinions. In fact, legend has it that in 1934, undershirt sales drastically decreased after Clark Gable took off his shirt in It Happened One Night to reveal that he wasn't wearing an undershirt. This idealization of celebrities that had carried on from the 1920s caused many Americans to fear the negative repercussions of film. Still, Hollywood and other mass media culture continued gaining popularity. The arts were starting to flourish as people created work to depict the life of the 30s. For instance, John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath discusses the life of a family that was forced to relocate to California because of the effect of the Great Depression. Dorothea Lange, a photographer, documented the life of migrant farm workers.
Environment and geography.
Because of bad agricultural practices, a dust bowl quite literally swept through the American Midwest in the 1930s. Combined with severe drought, soil blew into the atmosphere, destroyed farmland, and killed livestock in parts of Texas, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. It all spelled disaster.
That's where FDR came in. He didn't merely work for temporary improvement of the environment. Instead, he was one of the first presidents to work on sustainable development in terms of conservation. In essence, his approach to the environment was based on long-term planning. Part of this effort was the Shelter Belt Project, which planted a line of trees in western Oklahoma, preventing long-term erosion and serving as a windbreak.
He also implemented the Soil Conservation Agency, which is still around today as the Natural Resources Conservation Service. This program paid farmers to use healthy soil management and farming practices. However, the most important part of Roosevelt's plan was the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, which focused on hiring young men to plant trees, build reservoirs, improve national and state parks, and dig ditches.
Not only were many jobs created, but progress was also made in terms of flood control, water conservation, and preventing further soil erosion. The creation of Roosevelt's Forest Army was perhaps his most successful initiative, utilizing two resources that had gone wasted until then: land and young men. It all represented a shift in American attitude from a conquering nature mindset to a more sustainable one of working with nature and conserving its resources for future generations.
Migration and settlement.
As job opportunities became increasingly scarce, hostility towards immigrants grew. In many cases, the government deported immigrants, sometimes willingly but often through coercion. Though FDR himself wasn't a nativist, these and other anti-immigration policies from the Hoover administration continued through his time in office. Coupled with the economic crisis America was experiencing, it discouraged many immigrants from moving to the U.S.
However, migration within the U.S. did increase. White families from the Midwest, affected by the Dust Bowl, moved into California in search for jobs, adventure, and new opportunities. As they struggled to settle, they slowly realized California had too many people living in it already. To accommodate the influx of workers, Californian wages dropped.
Midwestern African Americans, on the other hand, would not move towards the West Coast, stubbornly facing the Dust Bowl and the severe drought that followed. They feared segregation and a plight like the Japanese had had in San Francisco in 1906.
Some migrated to the north, where they hoped to reap the benefits of the New Deal. However, these programs were often administered by local officials and therefore tainted by their personal racist biases.
America in the world.
The Great Depression was not strictly an American issue, but rather a global phenomenon. Almost every country was affected as international trade dropped by 30%. Eager to maintain power in Latin America, Roosevelt advocated Pan-Americanism. He aimed to achieve cooperation, whether economic or cultural, between all North and South American countries.
FDR also endeavored to create a less intrusive perception of America. In 1933, he named his approach the Good Neighbor Policy. The United States would be less dominating, less concerned with exploitative business practices, and less militant. Calling back troops from Haiti and Nicaragua, as well as giving more sovereignty to Panama, his perceived goodwill surged Roosevelt's popularity in Latin America. He also tried to negotiate diplomatic relationships with the Soviet Union.
In times of economic crisis, the U.S. was determined to stay out of war. In the hopes of not repeating old mistakes, the Nye Committee was established, investigating how Americans had been drawn into the First World War. The committee concluded that because bankers and weapon dealers made the most money out of the war, they were most likely the prime reason America had entered the war in the first place.
I trust that in the days to come, our neutrality can be made a true neutrality.
The Neutrality Act of 1935 and 1936 prohibited the sales of arms and munitions to countries that were at war, as well as prohibited Americans from traveling on warring countries' ships and extending credit to belligerents.
Isolationists were thrilled with these acts. However, many people, including Roosevelt, favored collective security and feared that isolating friendly countries was a threat to this. He signed the acts with reluctance, and they led to the sentiment that U.S. neutrality laws didn't distinguish between the aggressor and victim, only encouraging war. It is important to note that FDR was not able to end the Great Depression. However, by the end of his second term, unemployment rates were much lower, and public opinion of the government was soaring.
Let us never forget that government is ourselves and not an alien power over us. The ultimate rulers of our democracy are not a president and senators and congressmen and government officials, but the voters of this country.